My neighbor has been stealing my packages for months, but what I found on the security footage shocked me. It all started innocently enough, or at least that's what I thought at first. I live in a quiet neighborhood, the type where everyone knows each other by name and you can count on your neighbors to collect your mail when you're on vacation. I've lived here for nearly 5 years, and during that time, I've never had any reason to feel unsafe. We don't have fences between the yards because it's that kind of place, the trusting kind. But over the past 6 months, I started noticing something strange. Packages I'd ordered were showing up as delivered, but when I got home, they weren't there. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. Maybe they'd been delivered to the wrong house. That happens sometimes, right? So I'd wait a few days and then check with my neighbors. No one had seen anything. The delivery services would apologize and send replacements, but the missing packages became more frequent. What started as a small inconvenience quickly turned into a mystery. I'm not a paranoid person by nature, but after losing a few expensive items, including a brand new tablet, I started to get worried. Who would be bold enough to steal from my porch in broad daylight? I thought maybe it was the delivery guys, maybe they weren't leaving the packages at all. So I started tracking my orders obsessively, refreshing the tracking page every few hours to see when they would arrive. I even made sure to be home when certain packages were scheduled for delivery. But no matter what I did, some of them just kept disappearing. The weird thing was, it wasn't every package. Sometimes they'd arrive just fine. Other times, they'd vanish without a trace. It felt like whoever was taking them knew when I wasn't home. That's when the paranoia really set in. I started asking around the neighborhood. Maybe someone had seen something, or maybe other people were having the same problem. But when I brought it up with my neighbors, they seemed confused. No one else had missing packages. My neighbor across the street, Mark, said he hadn't noticed anything suspicious. Karen, the woman next door, even joked that it was probably kids playing pranks. I laughed along with her, but deep down, I knew this wasn't a prank. Someone was deliberately taking my stuff. I just didn't know who or why, and it was starting to drive me crazy. I became obsessed. Every time I ordered something, I would rush home after work to see if it was still there. I even started leaving little notes for the delivery drivers, asking them to hide the packages in less obvious places. But still, the thefts continued. I was losing sleep over it, constantly checking my front door, wondering if the next package would be taken before I got to it. My friends thought I was overreacting, but they didn't understand. This wasn't just about the things I was losing, it was about feeling like I was being watched, like someone was keeping tabs on me. It was around this time that I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought a security camera, one of those cheap motion-activated ones you can set up on your porch. It was discreet enough that I figured whoever was stealing my packages wouldn't notice it. I installed it right above the door, angled to capture the entire front yard. I linked it to my phone so I could get alerts whenever there was movement. I didn't tell anyone I had set it up, not even my girlfriend. I wanted to see what was happening without tipping anyone off. For the first few days, nothing happened. I got a few alerts from the camera, but it was just the usual stuff. Mailmen dropping off letters, kids riding their bikes past the house, and the occasional stray cat wandering onto my porch. I was starting to wonder if maybe the camera had scared the thief away. Maybe whoever it was had seen it and decided to stop. But then, one day while I was at work, I got the notification I had been waiting for. Motion detected at your front door. My heart raced as I pulled up the live feed on my phone. What I saw made my stomach drop. It wasn't some random person in a hoodie or a stranger from another neighborhood. It was Mrs. Jacobs, my elderly neighbor from 2 doors down. Mrs. Jacobs, the sweet old lady who always waved when she saw me, who baked cookies for the neighborhood at Christmas, who offered to water my plants when I was on vacation, was taking my package. She wasn't even subtle about it. She walked right up to my porch, picked it up, and walked back to her house like it was the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't believe it. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping that maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe she was just picking it up for safekeeping. Maybe she thought it had been delivered to the wrong address. But as I watched the video, there was no mistaking what had happened. She didn't knock on the door. She didn't leave a note. She just took the package and walked away. My mind raced with questions. Why would Mrs. Jacobs steal from me? She had never seemed like the type of person who would do something like that. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about all the times I had seen Mrs. Jacobs out in her garden, smiling and waving at me. All the times we had chatted about the weather or the neighborhood association. I couldn't reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the person I had just seen on the security footage. But I knew I couldn't let it slide. I had to confront her, no matter how awkward or uncomfortable it was going to be. The only question was how to do it without causing a scene. The next morning, I walked over to Mrs. Jacobs' house, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what I was going to say, but I couldn't just ignore what had happened. I knocked on the door, and after a moment she answered, smiling as usual. "Good morning, dear," she said cheerfully. For a moment, I almost lost my nerve. But then I remembered the footage, the way she had just taken the package without a second thought. "Mrs. Jacobs," I began, my voice shaking a little. "I've been having some problems with missing packages lately. And, well, I installed a security camera. It recorded you taking one yesterday." Her reaction wasn't at all what I expected. I thought she might deny it or get defensive, but instead, her face fell, and she let out a long, tired sigh. "Oh dear," she said quietly. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out." Her voice was filled with regret, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. I had been prepared for an argument, maybe some excuses, but not this. She didn't try to explain herself, didn't try to justify what she had done. She just stood there, looking down at the ground, as if waiting for me to pass judgment. I finally found my voice and asked the question that had been burning in my mind since I saw the footage. "Why, Mrs. Jacobs, why have you been taking my packages?" She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, and what she said next completely floored me. "It's not what you think," she began. I've been so lonely since my husband passed away last year. My children are busy with their own lives, and I don't see them often. When I saw the packages on your porch, I don't know why, but it made me feel like I had a connection to someone, like I wasn't so alone." Her confession hit me like a ton of bricks. Mrs. Jacobs, the sweet old woman who had always seemed so cheerful and put together, was stealing from me because she was lonely? I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to be angry, to tell her how wrong it was to take things that didn't belong to her, but another part of me understood. Loneliness can make people do strange things. She led me to her garage where she had been keeping the packages. They were all there, untouched, stacked neatly in a corner. She hadn't even opened them. I stood there, looking at the pile of my missing packages, feeling a mix of emotions: confusion, pity, anger. This wasn't the scenario I had envisioned. Mrs. Jacobs wasn't a thief in the traditional sense. She hadn't been stealing to gain anything material. She was stealing to fill the void left by her husband's death, by her children's absence. I asked her why she hadn't just talked to someone, why she hadn't reached out. She shrugged, her eyes still downcast. "It's hard to admit when you need help," she said. I didn't want to bother anyone. I didn't know what to do. I had come over expecting a confrontation, maybe even an apology, but this was something else entirely. Mrs. Jacobs was clearly struggling, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. I told her that I wouldn't report her, that I wouldn't tell anyone else in the neighborhood what had happened. There was no point in embarrassing her further. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and promised she wouldn't take anything again. I gathered up my packages and left her house, feeling more confused than ever. What had just happened? For the next few days, I kept replaying the conversation in my head. Every time I saw Mrs. Jacobs out in her yard, I felt a strange mix of emotions: pity, anger, confusion. I had never considered how lonely she must have been, living in that big house all by herself. But at the same time, I couldn't just forget that she had been stealing from me. It wasn't an easy thing to reconcile. I started wondering if other people in the neighborhood had been experiencing similar problems. Had she been taking packages from other houses, or was I the only one? Out of curiosity, I asked a few of my neighbors if they had noticed any missing packages. Most of them shook their heads and said they hadn't had any problems. Mark, the guy across the street, joked that maybe I just had bad luck with deliveries. But Karen, the woman who lived next door, hesitated before answering. "Actually," she said slowly, "now that you mention it, I have noticed a few things missing here and there. I thought maybe the delivery companies just messed up, but now I'm not so sure." My heart sank. Had Mrs. Jacobs been taking packages from Karen too? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Mrs. Jacobs might have been stealing from more than just me. If Karen had noticed missing packages too, who else might have been affected? I didn't want to believe that Mrs. Jacobs had been doing this for months, but it seemed like the only explanation. I considered telling Karen what I had found out, but I didn't want to start a neighborhood scandal. Mrs. Jacobs was already so embarrassed. Dragging this out into the open would only make things worse. Instead, I decided to keep an eye on things. I left my security camera up and continued tracking my deliveries closely, just in case. For the next few weeks, nothing went missing. It seemed like Mrs. Jacobs had kept her word. But then, one day, another package disappeared. This time, it wasn't just a small item. It was a large box containing a new piece of furniture I had ordered for my living room. I checked the camera footage, expecting to see Mrs. Jacobs again, but what I found was even stranger. It wasn't Mrs. Jacobs at all. It was someone else entirely. The person on the camera was a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't dressed like a delivery driver, and he didn't seem to care that it was the middle of the day. He walked right up to my porch, grabbed the package, and drove off in an old, beat-up car. I was stunned. All this time, I had been convinced that Mrs. Jacobs was the one behind the thefts, but now it seemed like there was someone else involved. Who was this guy? And more importantly, how did he know when my packages were being delivered? I didn't want to accuse Mrs. Jacobs of anything without proof, but it seemed like too much of a coincidence. Could she have been working with this guy somehow, or was this just a random thief who had taken advantage of the situation? I wasn't sure what to think. I saved the footage and called the police. They said they would send someone out to take a report, but in the meantime, I was left wondering what was really going on. Had I misjudged Mrs. Jacobs, or was this something bigger than I had realized? I couldn't stop thinking about the man on the camera footage. He was bold, walking right up to my porch in the middle of the day like he had nothing to hide. Who was he? And how did he know when the package would be there? Was he just an opportunistic thief, or was there more to it? The police arrived a few hours later, and I showed them the footage. They took notes and assured me they would investigate, but I could tell from their tone that package theft wasn't exactly high on their list of priorities. Still, they said they'd keep an eye out. After the police left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't just a random thief. I started rewatching all the old footage from my camera, looking for any clues I might have missed. I'd been so focused on Mrs. Jacobs that I hadn't considered the possibility of someone else being involved. As I reviewed the recordings, something caught my eye. On one of the days a package had gone missing, I noticed a car parked down the street for several hours. The same beat-up car the man in the footage had driven. He must have been watching my house, waiting for the delivery. I decided to confront Mrs. Jacobs again. I didn't want to accuse her outright, but I needed to know if she recognized the man in the footage or if she had seen anything suspicious. When I knocked on her door, she seemed surprised to see me again so soon. I showed her the footage of the man taking my package, and her face went pale. She quickly shook her head. "I don't know who that is," she said, her voice trembling. But there was something in her eyes that made me think she wasn't telling me the whole truth. Was she scared of him? I pressed her a little gently. "Are you sure, Mrs. Jacobs? He looks like he knew exactly when the package was delivered. Do you think he could be someone from around here?" She hesitated for a moment, biting her lip before finally speaking. "I've seen that car before," she admitted quietly. "It's been parked down the street a few times. I didn't think anything of it at first, but now that you mention it." Her voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She was hiding something, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what it was. That night, I lay in bed replaying our conversation over and over in my head. Mrs. Jacobs was clearly scared, but why? Who was this guy, and what was his connection to her? I didn't have any solid proof, but something told me Mrs. Jacobs knew more than she was letting on. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. What if she was in some kind of trouble? What if this man was threatening her or forcing her to take the packages? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just theft. The next day, I decided to keep a close eye on her house. I wasn't trying to spy on Mrs. Jacobs, but I couldn't let go of the idea that something bigger was going on. I sat by the window for most of the afternoon, watching as people came and went from the neighborhood. A few hours later, the same beat-up car appeared. It parked a few houses down, just like before, and the man from the footage got out. My heart started pounding. He wasn't coming to my house this time. He was heading straight for Mrs. Jacobs' front door. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Confront him? I felt paralyzed as I watched the man knock on Mrs. Jacobs' door. She opened it cautiously, and after a brief exchange, he stepped inside. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but something about the way Mrs. Jacobs stood, tense, with her arms crossed, made it clear she was uncomfortable. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but I hesitated. What if I was overreacting? What if this was all just some strange misunderstanding? I needed more information before I made any rash decisions. I waited for what felt like an eternity, watching the house like a hawk. After about 20 minutes, the man finally left, walking back to his car with the same casual attitude he had before. Mrs. Jacobs didn't come back outside. I wanted to rush over and ask her what was going on, but I knew she wouldn't tell me anything, at least not yet. I needed to approach this carefully, or I might never find out the truth. Instead, I decided to keep watching the house over the next few days, hoping to catch more clues about who this guy was. For the next few days, things were quiet. No sign of the man, and Mrs. Jacobs went about her usual routine, gardening in the mornings, waving at neighbors, smiling like nothing was wrong. But I knew better now. I knew there was something going on behind those closed doors, something she wasn't telling me. I kept my camera up, recording everything that happened in front of my house, just in case. Then, one afternoon, I got another alert. Motion detected at your front door. This time, when I opened the feed, it wasn't Mrs. Jacobs or the strange man. It was another person entirely. A young woman, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s, was standing on my porch, looking around nervously before picking up a package that had just been delivered. She didn't take it right away. Instead, she seemed to be debating with herself, glancing over her shoulder as if someone was watching her. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. First Mrs. Jacobs, then the strange man, and now this woman. What the hell was going on in my neighborhood? She eventually took the package and hurried away, but not before I captured her face clearly on camera. I was done waiting. I took the footage to the police station the next day, determined to get some answers. I showed them the videos, first of Mrs. Jacobs, then the man, and now the woman. The officer who took my statement seemed surprised at how organized it all looked. "This doesn't look like random theft," he said, frowning at the screen. "It looks like these people know what they're doing." He promised to escalate the case and said they'd start monitoring the area more closely. Still, I couldn't help but feel like we were missing a key piece of the puzzle. When I got home, I checked my porch again. This time, no packages were missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to go back to Mrs. Jacobs' house, hoping she would finally open up to me. I knocked, and after a long pause, she opened the door, looking more tired than I had ever seen her. "Mrs. Jacobs, please," I said gently. "I need to know what's going on. I've seen the footage of the man, and now there's a new woman taking my packages. Are you in some kind of trouble?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. Through shaky breaths, she explained everything. The man was her nephew, someone she had tried to help out after he lost his job. At first, he just needed a place to stay, but things quickly spiraled out of control. He started using her home as a base for his shady dealings, convincing her to help him with small things, taking packages here and there, letting people come by to pick things up. She didn't know what was in the packages, but she was too scared to ask. "He threatened me," she whispered. "He said if I didn't do what he asked, he'd take the house." I was horrified. Mrs. Jacobs had been caught up in something much bigger than I had imagined. She wasn't just lonely, she was being manipulated and threatened by her own family. "Why didn't you call the police?" I asked, my voice full of concern. She shook her head. "I was too scared. He said no one would believe me. And now there's a woman involved." Her eyes widened as she realized how far this had gone. I nodded and told her about the footage. "It's not too late to get help, Mrs. Jacobs," I said softly. "You don't have to go through this alone." With her permission, I called the police again and explained the new details. They arrived quickly this time, treating it as a more serious case than just package theft. They interviewed Mrs. Jacobs, and I could see the relief on her face as she finally told them everything. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. They assured her that they would investigate her nephew and the woman in the footage, and that she would be protected from any retaliation. I felt a wave of relief too, knowing that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. In the days that followed, things started to calm down. The police kept a close watch on the neighborhood, and I stopped seeing suspicious cars parked down the street. Mrs. Jacobs and I began to rebuild our relationship, though it would never quite be the same. I helped her get in touch with her children, and they visited more often now that they knew what had been going on. She wasn't alone anymore. As for the man and the woman from the footage, they were arrested a few weeks later, and it turned out they had been running a small theft ring, using Mrs. Jacobs as an unwitting accomplice. I kept the security camera up for a while longer, just to be safe, but things went back to normal pretty quickly. Packages stopped disappearing, and the neighborhood felt peaceful again. I still think about how close I came to never finding out the truth. If I hadn't installed that camera, I would have continued losing packages, never knowing that Mrs. Jacobs was being manipulated by her own nephew. It was a strange and difficult situation, but in the end, I'm glad I was able to help her get out of it. Now, whenever I see Mrs. Jacobs, she smiles at me with genuine warmth and relief. The tension that once hung between us is gone, replaced by an unspoken understanding. We both went through something we never expected, but we came out on the other side stronger. I've learned not to judge situations at face value because sometimes there's a lot more going on than we realize. What started as a simple case of package theft turned into something much deeper. A reminder that people, even the ones we think we know well, can carry burdens we don't always see.